So we've been spending the last couple of weeks looking at the early church, understanding kind of where it was going and how it was growing, because it had such phenomenal growth from the time it began with just the small groups of disciples waiting to see what Jesus was going to do next, through all of those early years in the first century into this great and incredible church. And so we've been kind of looking at that growth and how it was happening. And at the same time, they were also maturing as a church and as an organization, and how they were going to get to all of those places. But they suffered their own struggles, though, in the middle of all of that. What we talked about last week, how those struggles can be predictable, though. As they were growing, you could look at it and you could say, as they were maturing and growing, that the type of struggle, not the specifics, but the type of struggle, we knew what was going to happen. And so we looked at this little chart up there that said, we've got these like 5 phases of growth that they were going to happen. And after each phase, we knew what the next big struggle was going to be as they were trying to make that growth into the next place, into the next phase. And your choice then at those places of struggle is that some never grow beyond that, so they stay right there. Others will begin to decline afterwards, or you continue to grow after that. And that's what we've been watching in the early churches, how they deal with that. And so we said last week that the early church found itself through those first couple of phases dealing with the struggles they had. And then we got to the next big place of struggle, and it was they kind of got their leadership sorted out, but as they kept growing, they were growing beyond the ability of just one person or a small group of people to be able to handle things. And so that was their next point of conflict. Now that was going to be a big place. And so we found ourselves in this place of that delegation phase and the coordination phase. We'll watch as the church throughout its history bounces back between those places. Because the thing about any good model is that on paper, it looks like, oh, well, we know what's going to happen. You're just going to do this. If any of you have lived longer than about 2 or 3 days in life, you know that's not how reality works. And in fact, what happens is that we get to some of those places and we may bounce back and forth for a while. So it's not a nice straight line that we see, but there's going to be some bouncing back and forth. And the church is the same way. Throughout our history, we've kind of been bouncing back and forth, mostly between that coordination and that delegation phase. That place where we kind of send more leaders out, and that place of, kind of having regional centers, and then things kind of fall back for a while and we go back. The goal is to get to that last phase. On this model, it's called the collaboration phase, but we describe that in a little bit different terms. Our goal is to get to what is described at the end of Revelation, to the new heaven and new earth, the holy city, the new Jerusalem. That's that place where we are seeking after. And it's hard to get there. In fact, we can't get there really in this life at all. There's a reason why it comes at the end of the book of Revelation, because that's where it will ultimately come. But there are some characteristics, though, that we can begin to see of what that looks like. And the first thing is to know, and we always recognize that as people, we are going to be limited and we're going to be fallible. And that's going to be true in the New Jerusalem, and then, as it is now, that we aren't God, we're still going to have those limitations. But the difference that will be is that through God's grace, we will no longer be defined by them. More importantly, we will no longer define others by those limitations and those fallibilities. What we're searching for, then, is how we share those limitations. How we share those fallibilities. Often in the world today, we talk about how we like to build on our strengths, and we join our strengths with other people's strengths to see what we can do, and that's great, but there is surprisingly even greater strength when we can share our limitations and our fallibilities. Where we said that we are all limited differently from one another, and in one way of thinking, you say you bring everyone's limitations together and nothing will get done because we're all limited in crazy ways, and so where are we going to go? But it's also a place of strength, and we know and we say, yes, we are all limited. Here's how those things come together. And yet, through God's grace, we can do even more. What does this look like? Paul describes this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is not just the love chapter that we read at every wedding. Liam Whittington got married yesterday, had a great service. He asked me at one point, what are scripture passages that we could use? And I went back and I looked at like 50 to 75% of the weddings that I do all use 1 Corinthians 13. It's very common for weddings. But it's more than just for weddings. At one point in there, Paul gets towards the end of the chapter, he says, now I see as if in a mirror dimly, then I will know face to face. It's a great description of where we are. Sometimes it feels like we're looking through a mirror and the light is dim, and maybe it needs to be wiped down a little bit because we have a hard time seeing our reflection in there. Or if Paul were writing today, he would say, now I see as if on a Zoom call with that internet connection. Right? That is, we all have a little bit more experience with that than we want. But then I will know face to face. Then we'll see the whole reality of things, not just what is being reflected. In Methodist circles, we have a way of describing this that's even more. We talk about moving on to perfection. This is John Wesley's thing that he talked about that is a way of describing what we do in this life. And it's not that we become perfect, that we magically never do anything wrong ever again, but as we move on to perfection, that is where we align ourselves so closely with Jesus Christ that whatever limitations or fallibilities or sins that we have no power over us. That if we have reached that place of perfection, those things have no power, so that when we do sin, when we do run up against our limitations, when we do run up against the things that we are fallible for, they won't detract us. They won't take us away from Jesus Christ. That we're so closely aligned with him that we can stay in that place. Now, imagine that kind of life, but imagine that instead of just one or two people, it's an entire congregation, or it's an entire community of faith, or denomination, or all people who profess to be Christians all across the world, or all those who in time will come to know that God is Lord and that Jesus shows us the path for that. Imagine that all of those people, billions and billions of people now, have reached that place of perfection, where they are so closely aligned with who Jesus is, that sin and limitations and all of that have no power over them. That's what we're describing. Living in that kind of world. Imagine the power that is in that place. But it's a hard place to get to. It's a hard place to reach. Because of all the things that we have to deal with in this world to go through to get there. So this morning we're going to be looking at what is that first step to getting in that direction. And to get there, no surprise, I've got kind of a silly question for you all this morning. And that is, why do peacocks have such bright colors? Anyone have a guess, know why peacocks have such bright? If Briar were up here, I'm sure he would probably have an answer for me really quickly. Peacocks have bright colors because it's only the male peacocks that have the tails with the big fans, with all the bright blues and golds and colors on there, and the eyes that are on there. It's because they're attractive to the women. Guys, single guys, this is your information if you ever need to know this. Dress up like a peacock, that apparently works. I don't actually recommend that, but that's why, and we're going to actually get to why here in just a second, but that's what they do. They have those big bright fans because, and the bigger the fans, the more colorful they are, the more attractive they are to the peahens. I didn't know that's what female peacocks were called, the peahens. That's what's more attractive to them. Now, we're going to press this image a little bit this morning because we take that word, and it's not used quite so much in today's vernacular, but we take that word not just as a name for a bird in the English language, but we've also made it a verb because Emily gets onto me for this all the time. I like to verb nouns on a regular basis, but we do. We have to peacock that we use in the English language or describe someone as peacocking. What are they doing? Showing off. Exactly. Generally not a positive characterization of someone, right? We said they're showing off, they're strutting their stuff, they put their fan out there for everyone to see, right? So that it can be seen, and they can be seen to be very impressive. And We assume, we make some assumptions about folks that are doing this. Generally, either they are hiding something, or they're not hiding anything, right? They're just covering up all of the empty space that's behind them, right? These are the assumptions that we make. And they make a great way, peacocking makes a great way of hiding our own limitations, our own fallibilities. We try to cover those things up as much as we can because we don't want folks to see them. Now here's the rub about doing this in the world we live in today. And that is that we are able to get a tremendous amount of stuff done by doing just that, right? We minimize our limitations. In fact, one of the things about being a peacock is you put that out there, you know just how big that fan is. We are well aware, most of us, of what our limitations are, the amount that we can do, and just how far we can go. And so we try to press that as much as we get. Our fan is out there and it is great, but we also know when we've overextended ourselves, right? So here's the thing about peacocks. I didn't know this until my Google search history is always very strange. But I didn't know this. I was looking into this. Do you know why peacock fans are so brightly colored like they are? It's the way those fans are constructed. It's the light reflecting off the things that bind them together, that give them their structure, that let them put them out. And so that's where that bright color comes from. It comes from the things that are connecting all of the pieces together. The problem is they can get too big. And like anything, if it gets too big, eventually it's going to exceed what it can handle, and it will break, and it will fall apart. When we get to be too much, things can fall apart, and they will break. And we live in a world that loves its peacocking, because that's the way that things seem to run. But there's natural limitations to how far it can get us. It can only ever get us so far before it breaks down. And all of those things then that we're trying to hide back behind there will be seen by everyone. So the question becomes, how do we move beyond that? How do we get beyond that place? This is where we pull in another common description of the Christian life. It's the already but not yet. Sounds like an odd way of saying things, but the not yet is that we are not yet to the new heaven and the new earth, the new Jerusalem and the holy city. There's a reason why that comes at the very end of the book of Revelation, because we aren't there yet, and it's going to be a long time before we ever get there. But the already part of that is that as people of faith, as people who believe in Jesus Christ, as people who have received God's grace in this life, we can work on living as if we are already there. Not being perfect at it, no expectations of doing it right every single time, but we can move in that direction. That's the goal. That's the next step, is to take that step a little bit farther into living into what that means. Here's where we come into our scripture reading for today. We're actually in 2 Corinthians today. We're kind of stepping out of the book of Acts a little bit, but that's because here we're getting a little bit more of an important thing that is going on that Paul writes about in many places throughout his letters. And this is, he's writing about the collection. The collection is this important component of this ongoing struggle in the early church. Remember, the most important conflict in the early church as we see it in the New Testament, and not persecutions, they're not the martyrdoms, those things are all still waiting to happen. They are, some of those at the time Paul is writing are maybe a decade away. Many of them are 50 years away before they really come and those things happen. But the biggest conflict that they are working through right now is the conflict between Jewish believers and Gentile believers in the church. These two different groups of folks that are trying to figure out how do they share in faith together, because they're seemingly coming at this from opposite sides. And so they were working on figuring out how to make this work. We don't get to that last phase of collaboration without going through all of the other phases and all of the other struggles before it. Sometimes because we're hard-headed, we're going to repeat a few of them because that's what we do. But part of that is always, as we do that, we are maturing every time that we go through there. We're growing a little bit more. We're building more relationships as we go, working towards that end. And so the early church was working on this, but they were still facing this giant struggle between these two largest groups that were solidly divided from one another. So there's two different ways you can handle this. On the one hand, you can go about it in a peacocking sort of way, where everyone puts their fans out for everyone to see just how good they are. And the discussion then that comes between these two groups, and they're both going to be saying the same things at this point. They're saying, look at how many believers we have. Look at how many new converts to Christ that we're making every month. Look at how much time we spend in study. Look at how much time we spend in prayer. Look at how much we are giving to the poor and the needy. I mean, we do this. In good technological terms now, we don't call these like peacock fans, we call these dashboards. So you can keep track of everything that you are doing on a regular basis. And that's what we're doing. Now, the difference comes when the Jewish believers get to one point and they say, look at how faithful we are, and we are able to be faithful because look at how we are keeping the law and the prophets. The Gentiles on the other side are going, look at how faithful we are. We can be as faithful as you are, and we don't need to keep the law and the prophets. There's the conflict, and it's a big one. So the question becomes, how do they overcome this conflict between these two groups? This is where humility is incredibly important. One side has to start it, though, and generally for it to be most effective, that humility has to come from the side that has the most power or the most prestige or the most authority. In this case, it was the Jewish church, because they were the home base for the followers of the way, for Jesus' followers. And so they said to the Gentile church, through Paul, they said, Paul, all right, we can go with this. We can go a long way with this, but we need you all to do one thing. Just remember the poor. That's what we want. Remember the poor. We can work through the rest of it. And Paul latches onto that and says, okay, we can do that. And this was important because in the Jewish faith and Jewish tradition, there is this overwhelming desire to help those who are in need and those who are poor. But remember, that also gets reflected in the early church. Remember our snapshots from the early parts of the book of Acts, where you've seen this slide a few times in the last couple of weeks. They were sharing what they had. They were giving to others. They had their focus on the mission, and there was an abundance of grace through all of this. Giving to others is a key part of what made them in the early church. And they said to Paul, keep doing this. And Paul says, okay. So Paul goes back to the Gentile churches and he says to them, we need to give. And he asked them to give, and not just to give, but to give generously. This became known as the collection. And we're going to see this come back multiple times in Paul's writings as he is talking to these churches and asking them to give, so that those collections are going to be taken together and they're going to be sent back to the church in Jerusalem so they can be used to help the poor and the needy and to support the ministry of the church. And in this part of 2 Corinthians, Paul is doubling down on this with the church in Corinth, saying, all right, you've heard me talk about this before. This is not a new topic for you. You know this is coming. Let's make sure we get this done, because this is an important part of who we are. So Paul is working on them to make sure that is good. Paul's response, the church's response to this conflict and to this struggle could have gone a couple of different ways. They could have all put their fans out and continued down that road, and expecting everyone to conform to their particular view of how things were supposed to go. And the problem with that is that it can only ever become more restrictive over time. Very rarely does that become less restrictive. So the more, that is bounded thinking. So the more boundaries, the more bindings you put on that, the more restrictive that naturally becomes over time. That's just how things go. Rarely does that ever loosen up. On the other way they could have done, that would be the path that leads them towards collaboration. Where that says that we are not in agreement, but we can come alongside with each other. And this is centered thinking. Being centered on Christ, saying we're going to keep that focus on Him, knowing that we're going to have lots of disagreements along the way, but we're going to figure out how to work through those as long as we come alongside with each other to make this work. This is what we're seeing in the collection. This was why Paul was holding on to it so much when he was going back to the Gentile churches, saying, let's get this together. We'll keep our focus in the right place. Now the problem with this is centered set thinking. The problem with that is that it takes a great deal of humility to make that work. The other problem with that is that at some point you have to figure out how do you put reasonable boundaries on things, because you can get too far out there and nothing has any meaning. But this is the first step. This is the first step that we see them making as they come together. It would have been easy for the Gentile church to look at what was going on and say, if we just wait them out, we'll be okay. Because the Gentile church had a whole lot more possibility and potential ahead of it than the church in Jerusalem. There were a lot more Gentiles in the world than there were Jewish folks who were going to believe in Jesus. They could have said, we could have just waited, we could have done our own thing, and we could have kept doing what was going on. And the problem with that was that they weren't wrong. They maybe weren't right, but they certainly weren't wrong in that. They could have kept going that way, just put their fan out there, and they would have kept going forward. But their response to the collection that was going to be gathered and sent back to Jerusalem was supportive. It understood the struggle. It didn't try to be better than the others, but they said, we'll come along with you and we'll make this work. Doesn't say that there's not still going to be problems down the road, because there's still going to be struggles. There are still going to be issues that come up. But they were working to no longer be defined by whose plumage is prettier, but they were being defined by the places that they can come together. First step. There's still a lot more to come after that. That's the first step we seek to try and make. And we can only do this. This is only possible because of the grace that comes to us through Jesus Christ. And so let us be a people that receives that grace, that keeps centered on who Christ is, and says to those who are around us, come join with us, and we'll figure this out as we go. But let us join together as we follow Christ as one people. Let us be those people. Let us do this work in Christ's name. Amen.